Okay, it's 1st of August, 2021, half moon, lunar observance, half moon waning, and we're a few days into the vasa period, which is usually full moon of July to full moon of October, roughly. If it's as late as it possibly can be, it's happened before that the vasa might start on the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd of August, the very latest, or the very earliest it might start on a full moon in the first few days of July. So this year we've had a somewhat late beginning of vasa period, so July 25th being the day we enter the vasa, July 24th the Sala Puja, and then July 25th entering the vasa, so about a week into the vasa, roughly. And then today will be the start of the first of our 2-week solitary retreat block. So we get this very precious time that happens during the vasa period where the monastic community will trade off taking 2-week retreats. There's be 4 people on each 2-week block and then 5 people on one of the blocks. And so you'll notice sometimes people will be missing, and then they'll reappear again, and then 4 different people will be missing. And generally we get these solitary retreats where we can take the meal on our own and practice on our own and see how that goes. And that's a very important part of the training. Is we might have this ideal that, well, we should always be practicing on our own. This is a monastery. We shouldn't do any work. We shouldn't do any activities. It's not the true practice. We should be practicing on our own. And then we get the opportunity to practice on our own, and wow, this is really difficult. Can I get a book to read or something? There's nothing to do. So we do have kind of a good balance here in our daily life in the community, but it is good to test ourselves and see how does the mind react when we do these 2-week solitary retreats. I found some of the experience of that could be very, very interesting. Like, how do I act when I'm just by myself? And there's nobody I have to be anybody for. I don't have to fulfill a certain task or be a certain way around certain people. If I'm just by myself, and what do I do? How do I act when I'm just by myself? So ideally, when we're by ourselves, we'd engage in the sitting and walking meditation, maybe develop some sort of chanting practice, memorize some chanting. There's a number of things we can do when we're on our own. Or do we try to just continue to distract ourselves? Do we take a novel onto our retreat and just read it? So that can happen as well. Whatever happens on a solitary retreat, when we're completely on our own, it's to be a learning experience. You can see how the mind is working. And that can be very hard to be with ourselves. So that's the reason meditation can be difficult. It's just we might have this idea too that meditation is something where we're going to sit down and feel peaceful, feel happy, be at ease. Then we come up against the mind, and the mind is nattering on about this and that. Or we might be embarrassed by what's in our mind, and we might think, it's really, I didn't sign up for this. The meditation isn't going well. We might think if there's bad thoughts in the mind, and the meditation isn't going well. And so we label it as a bad meditation. And if somebody asks, "Oh, how's your meditation going?" they say, "Oh, it's not going very well. A lot of greed, hatred, and delusion." And I remember that happening early on when I was in Anagarika, having a meeting with the co-abbots at that time. So we used to have co-abbots. We had Ajahn Pasano and Ajahn Amaro, and I remember meeting with them, and they were both there, and said, "Oh, how's your practice going?" I said, "Well, it's not going very well. It's just greed, hatred, and delusion, nonstop." And so Ajahn Pasano was like, "Oh, good." And Ajahn Amaro was like, "Yes, very good." What do you mean by that? So the medicine's working. So the whole point is to dredge up these things that remain hidden. These are the anusaya, the latent tendencies. So that is why we meditate, to dredge these things up. And it's not the case that, so it inevitably, we start meditating, these things come up, and we think, well, meditation has made my mind worse, so I should stop meditating. And in a way, the Buddha has a way of hooking us. So we come to meditate, and our first couple meditations, we might feel really good, really peaceful. So we keep doing it, and then as we keep doing it, then it gets really difficult. And we can't get back to that first peaceful meditation that we had. So we come up against the greed, hatred, delusion, and that's the whole training of the mind. There's no way around it except just through just going into it, seeing the dukkha of it, and then that's the whole Four Noble Truths and the entire path of practice, the Noble Eightfold Path. And we have this, sometimes it can be like a sinking feeling or a realization that to really have true happiness and a sense of ease in our lives, it's going to be a lifetime of work, a lifetime of practice. There's just no way around it. Or we might think, well, I'll just practice really hard as I can for a short period of time, and then I'll be enlightened, and then everything will be okay, and the rest of my life will just be easy, and I can just cruise through the rest of my life. And so that's very tempting as well. So then we practice very hard, and we run ourselves down, and we kind of work ourselves up, tie ourselves into knots, and maybe we get really tense, and then we see, well, okay, well, that wasn't it. That wasn't the way to do it. But that can be the beginning of our learning, so we start by going to extremes. But we can learn a lot from that. Been thinking about this word, contemplation. Recently has been the word Lokavidu. It's a word that we don't really expound on much or think about much. This is translated as knower of the worlds. The Buddha is Lokavidu. So this is a good word to think about and could be seen in many different ways. And when I think of Lokavidu, I think of it's a particular quality that the Buddha has, but also that as a monastic or as an alms mendicant, this is something that you develop because we all dress the same, we have shaved heads, we've given up like having a particular hairstyle, and we might have slight differences, like the color of our robes might be dyed slightly different. Some people are using chemical dye, some people are using natural dye in their robes, slight variations in the dye color of the robe. So that could be a very subtle expression or a subtle statement, but it's not that strong. It's not like being able to wear different clothes or have different styles, like really, so we don't have that much modicum of expression in the way we dress, the way our hair is. So what we do, though, as alms mendicants, and particularly we do these Tudong pilgrimages and the monks since the time of the Buddha, it was a wandering tradition. It's not dependent on being in a monastery. We have our precepts, and we can wander and live as monks anywhere, actually. Anywhere we can be given alms food. We can actually live as monks. We can live outside, except during the vasa period. During this period, we're supposed to have a kuti for ourselves, have a dwelling place. But outside of the vasa period, then we can actually wander. And so whenever we come into contact with somebody, then we experience a little bit of their lives, a little bit of their world. So we know their world. We are Lokavidu, knower of that world. And then when we leave that person and we come into contact with somebody else, then we come into contact with their world and we eat the food they like, and we experience what they're into, and we learn whatever knowledge they have. And so we're Lokavidu, we know that world. And so it's like a knower of the worlds. And then we part from that person and keep going on, and we meet with somebody else, and they have a very different world again. And we meet with their world, and we eat the food they like and that they want to offer. And we experience whatever knowledge they have, and we learn from that. And we know their world. So that's one way I've been thinking about this word Lokavidu in terms of knower of the worlds. And so we don't really, as an alms mendicant, we relate to people. We can flow into whatever different world we meet up with at any given time. And then our own personal world slowly starts to fade and gets worn away. It slowly gets worn away. And there can be a sense of vulnerability in that, and that's good, actually, that sense of vulnerability. Who am I? How do I define myself? And why is there even a need or an impulse to define myself or be somebody? So we start to have insight through being Lokavidu, or practicing as knowers of different worlds. Then we think, well, what is my world? How am I defined? What are my likes, my preferences? So that, as a monastic, that's very intentional on the Buddha's part. So that gets worn away. And worn away into what? Into purity, clarity, spaciousness, brightness. All these qualities we talk about. Freedom. So if I have my own world and define myself in a certain way, then I'm bound by that. My actions of body, speech, and mind are bound by that. So we can be bound by our own world, or we can be a knower of the worlds, and we can be unbound. That's one translation of Nibbana, unbound. Not bound in our own self-created box of perceptions and thoughts. And so we're free to, there's a potentiality there. And when there's that potentiality, then we can actually flow into any situation. And then when things come at us, there might be a imposition on us. So like if we meet with people or meet with each other in the monastery, and somebody might disagree with some way we're doing something or whatever, or some viewpoint that we hold, or some action that we're doing, and so we might be criticized, or somebody might want to impose something on us or control us in some way, or we might want to do that with others. So that's not being a knower of the world, but that's trying to be a controller of the world rather than just knowing it. And then we learn how to relate to our own minds, to be knowers of the worlds, of what's in our minds, rather than controlling it. That's seeing the mind as not self, actually seeing the body and mind as not self. And because if we actually sit down and meditate and we think, oh, we're thinking bad thoughts, we try to control those, try to get rid of those. We're thinking good thoughts, we try to hold on to those, try to make much of those. But that sense of trying to control something, so that's what we're looking at, is that impulse to control, or that illusion that we have some sort of control. So we're looking at the process. We're looking at the process rather than the content. Like, what's the process? What's the intentionality? That's, Buddha said, karma's intention, so we're looking directly at intentionality. And this could also be thought of as a philosophy of process. So we might think, okay, well, I have a thought of greed, or I have a thought of anger arising, or like thoughts of irritation toward somebody or toward ourselves. And so those thoughts arise, but those thoughts are conditioned by past thoughts, and so it's a habit, and something is happening in the present based on past conditions. So then, in the present, we have this reaction to it. We decide, how are we going to react to this? So like a thought of irritation, a thought of anger. How am I going to react to this? Could try to get rid of it. I could try to stamp it out, or I could run with it and try to, stir it up even more, put some more thoughts into it, proliferate more around it, get more irritated, more angry, more upset. So that process is what we're trying to look at, and that's what I believe the defilement the Buddha is pointing to. That's the real defilement. The real defilement is that trying to get rid of or trying to grab onto. So looking at that process when we try to get rid of things, or we try to cling to things, try to grab onto things. So that's the sati, that's the mindfulness. It doesn't mean we never grab onto things. Luang Por Chah said that you have to, normally we're grabbing onto things like this with our fist. So normally we're grabbing, we're holding on tightly. But he said it's not that you never hold things or never pick things up, but when you pick something up, say the mind that doesn't have clinging, when it picks something up, when it needs to, it picks it up like this. It doesn't pick it up like this, but it picks it up like this, and then it's peaceful. Then you can set it down any time. So you pick it up as long as it's helpful, and then set it down. And so we also say, like, letting go. We use this term, this phrase, letting go, and it's kind of hard to figure out what that means sometimes. Letting go, we get upset about something, or we're kind of in a bind. Our friend comes to us and says, "Well, just let go," and then that can be incredibly frustrating when somebody comes up to us and say, "Just let go," or "Just be mindful." How exasperating that can be if that happens, because it's not so clear actually what "just let go" actually means. Yes, the senior monks, the Krupa Ajahns, they talk about letting go, and they talk about the purpose of practice is to let go. But then there has to be some sort of base, so letting go, it doesn't mean just nothing. It doesn't mean we just shut everything off, because that's not possible. The process, the mind is still going. And letting go can't mean holding on somehow, because letting go is the opposite of holding on. So it doesn't mean really holding on to something, but I think what I've come to is letting go is skillful response. So letting go as skillful response, that means letting go is coupled with panya or wisdom. It means developing some discernment. And to develop discernment, then what we come back to is dukkha, seeing suffering. Anything, we're not really going to be able to drop it. We're not going to be able to let it go if we don't see the suffering of it. And that's something that just can't be emphasized enough. If we have an issue with anger, if we don't see the suffering of it, we don't see the drawback of it, there's just no way we're going to be able to drop it. We might repress it, we might deny it, but we're not going to be able to let it go. If we have some sort of greed, in the mind, some sort of wanting, longing, passion, then if we don't see the suffering of it, if we don't see the unsatisfactory nature of it and the drawback of it, then we might repress it, we might deny that we have it and block it out somehow, but we're not going to be able to let it go. So we don't really, on a very deep level, in the heart, in our heart of hearts, we don't really see that it has drawbacks. We don't really see that it's creating more problems for ourselves. So that's the Buddha's coming back to the Four Noble Truths, and that's a very practical but also a very ultimate realization. That's what we're aiming for. So how do we get there? We get there through the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. That's the translations of those things. That's samma. The word for right there is samma, meaning just right or in tune, balanced, perfectly balanced. All those things need to be balanced. So there is a path that the Buddha talks about that we get there, and that path can be distilled or summarized as sila, samadhi, panya. That's virtue, concentration, or we could say meditation, and wisdom. And panya is not an intellectual discernment, or when we say wisdom, it's not like book learning or something that we learned from reading the suttas, but it's when the heart knows something is dukkha. It's when the heart knows without a doubt that something isn't right, and it gets out immediately. It lets go immediately because it can't hold on to this fire that it's been holding on to. So we talk about this, but then not to be too hard on ourselves when we don't have these things yet, or too judgmental or critical of ourselves because we're still suffering, or we still get angry, or we still have greed or passion or whatever. It's a lifelong process. This is not something, unless you're a very rare individual, we all still have a lot of work to do in this area, and we're all still works in progress with that. And everybody's starting out in a different place too, so that's what we call the parami. Everybody has different parami. So coming into the world, we're actually all in a different place, and it's just going to harm ourselves to get caught in comparing ourselves to others, like, I can't do it, I'm not like the monks, or I'm not like the people who've become monastics. One of the teachings I heard from a visiting Ajahn from Thailand, Ajahn Ñāṇiko, I remember hearing this teaching when I was 1 or 2 years as a monk, and I believe he was about 29 or 30 at the time, or maybe 24, 25 at the time, 25 years as a monk. And just a teaching that stuck with me. And he said, you see the senior monks and you think, they had some sort of special quality which set them apart from ordinary people. So they were reborn already as, special beings who were destined for some sort of special path. But he said, no, it's totally not like that. He said, before I was a monk, I was a lay person, and I was just like anybody else here, but got inspired by the Buddha's teaching. And when you stick with it for long enough, and you do the training and you take on the precepts, then it does actually take hold. And the training actually does take hold over time, but it can take a long time. So he said, all you junior monks who think you're hopeless and not going to get out of suffering, don't worry, there is hope. It just takes a long time, and you got to stick with it and develop a lot of patience and be patient with yourselves. So that teachings like that, when I heard them early on, it really helped me to be able to stick with it. And even after a long time, we still need teachings like that to be able to keep going in the practice, because it doesn't stop. The mind doesn't stop, the body doesn't stop aging, the body doesn't stop relentlessly marching toward death, whenever that may happen. We don't know when that'll happen. We might have some sort of inkling, or may have had some sort of dream of when it might happen, but we don't really know. We can't really say exactly when we're going to die. Again, unless you're one of these rare beings who has insight in that way. You do hear the odd story of somebody like Ajahn Ñāṇiko, who knew exactly when he was going to die. But that's very rare. Yeah. Ajahn Ñāṇiko was one of Ajahn Chah's teachers, and his monastery is called Wat Mani Rat, and now Lungpar Liam's, one of Lungpar Liam's attendant, somebody who was Lungpar Liam's secretary for a long time, Ajahn U Tain, is the abbot there now, also a very good monk. And so Mani Rat, this particular monastery, and Ajahn Ñāṇiko was a disciple of Ajahn Mun, and he's pretty eccentric. He was known for just doing eccentric things. He practiced very, very hard and was attained realization quickly, and had very quick wisdom, and was very daring in his practice. And when he was living for a time with Ajahn Mun, and there was other great characters living there at the same time, Ajahn Mahabua, and many others who we may or may not have heard of. And there's a couple stories of note that just to show how eccentric Ajahn Ñāṇiko was. So they were on alms round one day, and Ajahn Ñāṇiko was actually, he was one of the more junior monks on the alms round, and so near the back of the line, and a goat came out of the village and charged toward Ajahn Mun. And as this goat was charging toward Ajahn Mun, all the other monks kept walking with their eyes downcast, but Ajahn Ñāṇiko noticed it and ran up to the front of the line and drop-kicked this goat just before it hit Ajahn Mun. And then Ajahn Mun turned and said, "Oh, at least one of my sons is looking after me." So, and then another time, it was again on alms round, and Ajahn Mun actually hadn't given a Dhamma talk for a long time. Sometimes he would just go for long periods of time without giving a talk, and the monks were kind of like, "Yeah, he hasn't given a talk in a long time, and kind of be nice if he would give us some Dhamma." And so Ajahn Ñāṇiko, on the way back from alms round, close to Ajahn Mun, just took food out of his bowl and started eating like a pickle, and which we're never supposed to do. That's really against the standards. And sure enough, that night Ajahn Mun gave this really fiery Dhamma talk about correct standards on alms round. And Ajahn Ñāṇiko, and everybody was cowering and shivering, and Ajahn Ñāṇiko was sitting up straight, smiling, because he got him to give a Dhamma talk. He succeeded. It's one more story just for fun. That another time that Ajahn Mun hadn't given a Dhamma talk for a long time, then Ajahn Mahabua was Ajahn Mun's upatak, his attendant monk, and and it was quietly going about duties and cleaning things under Ajahn Mun's kuti, and Ajahn Mun was. So these kutis sometimes are up on legs, on stilts, because it can flood in the monsoon season in Thailand. So Ajahn Mun was actually in the kuti up above, and Ajahn Mahabua was doing some cleaning and organizing things down below very quietly. And Ajahn Ñāṇiko came in and just started banging kettles and saying, and being loud. And Ajahn Mahabua was like, "Shh, shh, shh, he's up there. And it's kind of just ignored Ajahn Mahabua and just kept banging things and making a big racket, and then left. And Ajahn Mahabua was just terrified because Ajahn Mun, he doesn't want to be rebuked by Ajahn Mun, and then Ajahn Mahabua went to chase Ajahn Ñāṇiko down. What are you doing? He said, he hasn't given a talk in so long. I just want to get him to give a talk. And sure enough, that night again, he gave this really fiery Dhamma talk about being quiet while you're doing your duties. And again, everybody's kind of scared, but Ajahn Tongrat was very proud and sitting up straight and smiling. So anyway, at the end of his life, fast forward to the end of Ajahn Tongrat's life, he had many, many students around him, and he actually was very old and not really that sick or anything. Maybe he was a little bit infirm, but he was older, and he was with a lot of the monks sitting around one night outside, and they were practicing and meditating together, and then Ajahn Tongrat, he was giving a Dhamma talk, and then he said, "Okay, I take my leave from all of you now," and he laid down on his right side and passed away. So very rare beings can do that, but for most of us, we're not at that level. So we can learn from these stories, though, these great beings who we hear about, the teaching to see that we have to see the dukkha, that we have to see the suffering. And it doesn't mean we create pain for ourselves. We don't have to do that. We're already doing that all the time. But we just have to see that we're doing it. We have to see it clearly. And I probably use this analogy in almost every talk now, but can't say it enough, that it's like that your hand in a fire. When your hand is in a fire, you don't need to consult the text, consult the manual. What do I do when my hand is in a fire? It's just automatic. The hand is going to be pulled out automatically. We don't need to think about it, don't need to proliferate about it, or have some sort of book learning to know to do that. So really, wisdom is very much like that, that if the heart really sees that it's in fire or sees the suffering, then it's gonna pull out immediately. So that's the promise of the Buddha's teaching. But it takes this path and the practice, and it takes time, and it takes patience, it takes generosity, it takes all the qualities that get talked about in the suttas. It takes actually developing them for ourselves. Dhamma vichaya, thinking about Dhamma all the time. That's one of the bojjhangas, one of the 7 factors of awakening. Dhamma vichaya. So that means trying to apply the Dhamma, trying to apply the Four Noble Truths to our experience throughout the day. It's not just while meditating. It's not just that sitting down, okay, I'm going to practice calming meditation, samatha right now, or I'm going to practice vipassana meditation, I'm going to do an analytical meditation. We can do those things, and that's good. We need to do both of those things a lot. But doing it all the time, Dhamma vichaya, is walking up the hill, walking down the hill. When we go to sleep, how are we using our mind? When we wake up, how are we using our mind? How quickly can we establish mindfulness when we wake up? Are we able to bring the attention to the breath when we wake up, or what do we do when we wake up in the morning? So seeing how the mind is acting. And again, it's not judging ourselves like, it should be a certain way, but seeing it, seeing what is it like, how is it a certain way. And where do we keep getting stuck? Dukkha is like a thorn in the heart. It's like a barbed hook that's in the heart, and we can't just pull it out by a single act of will or a single spurt of hard practice. We have to work it out little by little. This barb that's deep in the heart, and it's painful to pull it out, but it's going to be the best if we get it out. We might think, well, I just want to leave it in there because it's too painful to get it out. So Longpo Cha talked about this as the suffering leading to the ending of suffering. It's that getting the barb out. We have to pull on it little by little, and we have to keep at it, and we have to work it work it out, and eventually we'll be able to get it out. But we have to keep working at it, and we can't give up. And it's embedded really deep in there, so we have to be just really persistent at getting it out. So that's one analogy for the practice as well. We can get that thorn out of the heart, get that barb out of the heart. Or we could think of it as the Dhamma is like strong, astringent medicine that we're soaking the heart in. And there's this crust of dukkha and crust of kama on the heart, and we need to dissolve that. We need to uncover what's actually there, uncover that purity. So Sila Samadhi Panya, the path, Four Noble Truths, coming back to Lokavidu, knowing the world, knowing the worlds, being a knower of the worlds. Doesn't mean to be a knower of the world doesn't mean you have to be a monastic. Also, you can actually develop those qualities as a layperson as well, but you have to actually make it conscious. So if we're able to say as a layperson, like we have a friend and we want to have a lot of empathy for them, or we just want to be there for somebody, we can be Lokavidu for that person. We can let go of our own world, our own preferences, and actually get interested in what they're interested in. That's also one way that we learn how to harmonize with each other. Why don't I drop what I want to do what they want to do? So through that we can create connections with others. I'll leave it there for this evening.